Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this segment of a series that we're calling Acting for Justice While Sheltering in Place, sponsored by Just Faith Ministries. Welcome to all of you. And for those of you who are on this call for the first time, just a little bit about the genesis of this program. As we started sheltering in place because of COVID-19, our staff started to reach out to graduates all over the country to ask how we could be helpful, thinking that people would want to talk about some of their experiences of ennui or angst or loneliness. Interestingly, that's not what they wanted to talk about. What they wanted to talk about was, what can I do to be helpful? And so this process was birthed by that collective voice that we heard loud and clear. So again, welcome to all of you. It's a delight to have you. I think we have a great program tonight, and I'm going to open with a prayer, very short reflection. This is actually from a 16-year-old girl, Amy Maddox, and these words are actually printed on a poster that's printed by the Teaching Tolerance Project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. So let us pray. Underneath, we are all the same. He prayed. It wasn't my religion. He ate. It wasn't what I ate. He spoke. It wasn't my language. He dressed. It wasn't what I wore. He took my hand. It wasn't the color of mine. But when he laughed, it was how I laughed. And when he cried, it was how I cried. Amen. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Over the years, Just Faith Ministries has enjoyed a robust relationship with Pax Christi USA. We have partnered on projects, programs, and all kinds of exciting initiatives over the many years. And one of the personal pleasures for me was traveling 4 times a year to the DC area to meet with representatives from our partners. And it was in that context that I first met Johnny Zokovitch almost 20 years ago. And he was then, as now, a thoughtful, caring man, intelligent, articulate, and really more than any of that, truly committed to the work in both his personal and professional life. So I'm delighted to have this kind of reunion of our work tonight, Johnny, and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker. Johnny is currently the executive director of Pax Christi USA, which is the National Catholic Peace and Justice Movement. Previously, Johnny served as senior staff at Pax Christi International in Brussels, promoting human rights and the promise of nonviolence and addressing conflict. In the year 2000, he founded the Gainesville, Florida Catholic Worker House, an intentional community serving and living with people who are homeless, addicted, impoverished, or mentally ill. And he lived there with his kids for 15 years. He holds an MA in theology with a concentration in biblical studies from the University of Notre Dame, and has written for or been featured in National Catholic Reporter, U.S. Catholic Belief Net, The Other Side, the Encyclopedia of Race and Racism, and elsewhere. So Johnny, we're delighted to have you with us tonight, and the microphone is all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Jack. It's really good to be with y'all. I also want to just say, Jack, that I'm going to have to get a snippet from you that I can show to my children, because I don't think they would recognize that same guy you were introducing. I really, really appreciate that. Thanks so much, Jack. I just want to start off by offering my thanks. Just Faith, as Jack has mentioned, it's played a big role in my own life. From my own participation in a group about 12 years ago to the number of Just Faith groups who sought out our work at the Catholic Worker, where I lived for nearly 15 years, as a way to step outside of their comfort zones or have cross-border experiences. To all of the people who either found Pax Christi USA because of their participation in a Just Faith program, or those Pax Christi USA members who have had their commitment as peacemakers deepened because of the resources they found within Just Faith. Just Faith has just played an immense, really important role in my own life, and I'm really grateful to be here. So all this is to say that I'm glad to be with you all tonight, and I consider you part of my extended community, whether or not we've actually met in person. And one of the nice things about Zoom calls is as people, drop in on the call, you get to see familiar faces, people you haven't seen for a while. And I saw a number of Pax Christi members, Janice Vanderhaar in Memphis, and Kathy Creighton out in Los Angeles, and Mary Ellen Quinn up in Maine. So it's really nice to see the overlap between Pax Christi USA and Just Faith. I also want to share that much of what I've gleaned on the topic that we're going to talk about tonight, that it's happened because of the relationships that have been a big part of my life within Pax Christi USA. Much of this presentation has been resourced by Pax Christi's own anti-racism team, which has been about the work of dismantling systemic racism inside of Pax Christi USA since 1999. True, too, is that my own racism has been unmasked and it's been challenged by friends and colleagues. Sometimes those folks have been people of color, and sometimes it's been through people who are white. Those experiences, their stories, have created the kind of cognitive dissonance that I needed to call into question my own unconscious bias, to help me deconstruct many of the basic assumptions that I lived by as a person who has benefited all my life from white privilege. So I don't come to you in a vacuum, nor does what I share with you today originate with me. Much of it has come to me wholly unearned as a gift, as grace. So, with recent events in our nation, I'm especially aware right now of the legacy of white supremacy, genocide, and colonialism that are part of my history, and how that legacy has poisoned the roots out of which grew this world in which all of us live. I come to you today first as a white man, and I want to acknowledge that my views and my experiences have been shaped by that privilege that's been accorded me because of my skin color. I also join you today from my home in the city of St. Louis, Missouri, a land that was once home to indigenous people like the Cahokia and the Osage and the tribes of the Illini Federation before they were dispossessed of this land by the French and the Spanish and the English. My home city is a place that intimately bears the scars and the legacy of both racism and colonization. And once this land was a refuge to escaped African slaves who would paddle up the Mississippi River and settle here. For generations, St. Louis has been ground zero for those competing histories of racism and the resistance that has been to racism. In St. Louis, race and racism aren't subtext, they are text. And this city's struggle is done in plain sight, and it's done out loud, and it's done every day. I think that this is the truth for the rest of our nation as well right now. So I think it's important for me to name my perspective and to own my own racism and to acknowledge how much work that I still have to do as a white person. This begins for me by cultivating a deep sense of humility, a recognition of all that I don't know, of all that I don't understand, and especially, I think, a willingness to listen to and to learn from the Jesus who identifies himself as one of the hungry, as one of the sick, the prisoner, the oppressed, as the one who is being crucified today. This Jesus is speaking to all of us today in our siblings of color, in the Black Lives Matter movement, and they're speaking to both the church and to the world. Too many times, for those of us here on this call who are white, we could avoid the urgency that a Black child being killed by a police officer should have exploded in us. Because that child didn't look like our son. It didn't look like our daughter. Sometimes, again, for those of us who are white, we've been like the vast majority of those people in the crowds in all of those biblical stories. We've been interested enough to kind of check things out, but we've also been too tied up in other things to leave our agendas and our pet projects, the important work that we have going on elsewhere, that we've been too tied up in those things to pick up and to join Jesus and to follow him on the way. For me, that's what I'm hearing right now in this moment. It's Jesus calling to us, clear as day, in all of those people who are crying out that Black lives matter. It's moments like now for which the call to discipleship is answered or it's bypassed altogether. That same Jesus who called Simon and Andrew, who called James and John on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, is calling to us today. And for those of us who want to call ourselves disciples of Jesus, who want to take that call seriously, the authenticity of that discipleship is up for grabs in this moment. We are being called to follow the biblical Jesus today in this movement that has arisen because a Black man, George Floyd, was crucified by a white police officer. We need to see in that moment, and the thousands of moments just like that one that happen to Black Americans every day in this country, we need to see the crucified Christ. That crucified Christ has been calling out to us from our communities of color that have been oppressed in a variety of ways for a long time. And for white people, it's been too easy to evade those calls. I was in my breakout room, I was talking with a woman, Pat, who was from St. Louis, who brought up Michael Brown in Ferguson. And that moment that we had the call to discipleship presented to us so blatantly and so obviously. I think of those communities, those families that are separated at our border, brown people that are separated because of the color of their skin, because of where they come from. We need to see in this moment that Christ is being crucified, and this is the Christ that we have been called to follow. So I think that this is an important moment for our country. And it's also been an important moment for Pax Christi USA. Pax Christi USA doesn't come to the struggle for racial justice all of the sudden. Some of the folks from Pax Christi that are on this call can vouch for that. They've been part of this movement for a long time, and they can talk better than I can about the history that we've had around issues of racial equity and racial justice, and especially the commitment that I'll share a little bit more about, which is our own engagement with the process of becoming anti-racist. So a little history I want to share with you. I want to give a little context for Pax Christi USA's work and the network that we're part of. Pax Christi USA is a section of Pax Christi International, and the International Catholic Peace and Justice Movement was ordained that by Pope John the 23rd. Pax Christi International started in 1945 as a peace and reconciliation movement between French and German Catholics. These citizens of different nations, but the same faith, had killed one another by the millions in two separate wars over a period of 30 years. And Pax Christi International was born out of that moment of incomprehensible killing, and in a context where suffering and loss had sowed the seeds of resentment, hate, and revenge. Into that cauldron, a small group of French and German Catholics took up the work of reconciliation and peace. And that movement, Pax Christi International, would spread all across Europe, and it spread throughout the world today. Now, 50 years ago, there was a small group of mainly lay Catholics in the United States who gathered together, and some of the names you might recognize, people like Bishop Tom Gumbleton, Dorothy Day, Eileen Egan, Gordon Zahn, and a few others. They were veterans of the anti-war movement and the farm workers movement, but they also had deep ties and had been trained within the civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s. This small group would align their organization, Pax Christi USA, with Pax Christi International, and that would be the time of our birth as an organization in 1972. But like a lot of organizations that promote ideals and values like peace and justice and equality, the systemic racism in the DNA of a country founded on white privilege and to serve white supremacy also infects every institution that's created in that context, including Pax Christi USA. In the mid-90s, Pax Christi USA did a membership survey that unearthed this little gem. Our membership was 97.5% white. Now, for an organization that called itself the National Catholic Peace and Justice Movement, this is problematic. It raises important questions regarding our organizational identity and who we claim to be, and really whether or not we can claim to speak as the Catholic Church, as a national Catholic organization, when our organization, membership-wise, is overwhelmingly white. Now, we were aware that there were thriving African-American Catholic communities throughout the United States, like in New Orleans and Baltimore, St. Louis, Chicago, and elsewhere. We also knew that the Catholic Church in the US had been growing in terms of Latinx membership for decades. And indeed, as I'm sure many of you know, and those of you who have read Brian Massengel's book, the membership in the Catholic Church today, people of color outnumber white Catholics. It was this recognition that Pax Christi USA's membership was almost totally white, and the incongruity between that and what it means to call ourselves a national Catholic peace and justice movement when we were almost entirely white, that led to a serious and a rigorous self-examination. And I think it became a transformative moment for Pax Christi USA. It was just over 20 years ago, so it's a matter of recent history. It's a single generation that Pax Christi USA made a commitment to embrace anti-racism and to examine the systemic racism within our own organization. We began this work with a partner, Crossroads Ministry, designed to accompany communities like our own in exploring what it means to undertake the work of anti-racist transformation. Our journey started in the mid-90s with anti-racism training, first for our National Council and key people in leadership, and eventually it led to a commitment that we would make organizationally in 1999, so just over a generation ago. And the vision that came out of that discernment was this, and we stated it, and it's part of our vision statement and our mission statement. Pax Christi USA seeks to embrace this new identity, this anti-racist identity, and do all of its work from an anti-racist perspective in the conviction that personal and systemic racism continues to perpetrate deep spiritual and social brokenness and endangers creation. For us, this meant re-examining our history, our mission, our structures, our policies and procedures, partnerships, our business dealings, our ways of working, every aspect of the organization, we needed to hold up to an anti-racist lens, to examine and assess who we were and how it was that systemic racism was intertwined with all of the things that made up who it is that we are as an organization. It meant dismantling the systemic racism that is woven throughout, and it also meant reconstituting our organization with that lens of anti-racism. It meant creating first a team within Pax Christi USA, the Pax Christi anti-racism team. And I know at least one member of that group is on this call tonight because I saw Kathy Creighton with us, that we would be trained in and we would train others in a common anti-racist analysis. And that this would help to facilitate the kind of steps that we needed to move toward an anti-racist identity. Now, as Jack mentioned, I lived at a Catholic worker house for 15 years. And during that time, I lived with and I worked alongside a lot of people who suffered from serious, serious addictions. One of the fellows whom I got to know at the first Catholic worker community that I was ever part of was, and this is how he described himself, an old-time alcoholic, and his name was Gary. And Gary used to come to me when he would see me talking to guys that were trying to recover, trying to get into recovery, trying to overcome their alcoholism or their drug addiction. Gary would come to me and he would tell me that for those guys that were just starting their recovery, they needed to realize that they didn't become an alcoholic or an addict overnight, and that it wasn't going to magically go away overnight. It was going to be a long haul. So, like every organization in our country, Pax Christi USA was not exempt or immune to being shaped to serve the white supremacy that has been rightly called our nation's original sin. And while we might have made that commitment to doing this work to become anti-racist 21 years ago now, it really is generational work. In this country, we have at least a 500-year legacy to overcome. So even now, a generation after making our commitment, that journey has really only just begun. And the steps we've taken have been baby steps. But there have been moments along the way that test where we are on that journey. The death of George Floyd and today's Black Lives Matter movement is one such moment of testing ourselves around our anti-racism commitment as an organization. It's a moment that especially gives the white people in our movement a chance to demonstrate that we've learned a thing or two over the past 2 decades. That we've learned what it means to be accountable to communities of color, especially those within our own church, and how to stand alongside them, to be allies, and maybe most importantly, to educate and challenge other white people and the whiteness of the church itself and the church's commitment to whiteness. Now, in October of this past year, I attended a racial justice conference at Fontbonne University here in St. Louis. And the reason that it was put on by the Catholic Racial Justice Collaborative of the Archdiocese of St. Louis. And I went especially because I was excited at seeing an old friend, somebody I had met about a decade ago, Reverend Joseph Brown. Now, Father Brown is a Jesuit priest, he's a scholar, he's a poet, and he's an African-American man. And as I mentioned, I met Father Brown several times before, including once when he brought everyone at our conference to their feet with his preaching at a Pax Christi USA National Conference in Chicago about a decade ago. Father Brown moves me and he challenges me like few people in the church do. And at this conference, Father Brown spoke, as always, passionately about racial justice, about his dissatisfaction with the racism that he witnesses within the church, its structures, and especially within the hierarchy. But he also issued this challenge that really, really stuck with me. He said at one point during his talk, with a heavy sigh as he leaned over the podium, that as a Black man, he was tired of talking about racism and racial justice. Just tired. He had been delivering the same message over and over and over again to audiences within the church, and he was tired. It was time, he said, for white people to step up to the podium and to talk about racism, to call for racial justice, to challenge the systemic racism within the church and society. White people, he said, needed to step up and speak out, especially to other white people. He said that the question of racism had to be as important to white people as it was to people of color. It's that challenge from Father Brown that drives the response that Pax Christi USA has had since the death of George Floyd and the recent rise, this recent incarnation of the Black Lives Matter movement. Pax Christi USA is still, after a generation, an organization that is made up overwhelmingly of white people, even as our demographics have changed somewhat, especially on our staff and in leadership. The majority of our membership is still largely white. But white people in Pax Christi USA, like myself, who have been the beneficiaries of 2 decades of anti-racist training, we need to pick up that work that is ours to do on racism, in society, in our own organizations, in our families and communities, and especially within the church. So, what has Pax Christi USA done? Now, I want to resist the urge to talk about what we have done lately, because I think that while we can frame it, the question as what have you done lately, I think the most important work that Pax Christi USA did started 20 years ago. It was all the work that happened over these last 20 years that made our community ready to respond to this moment. Ready to respond to the moment when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, or when the massacre happened at Emmanuel AME Church in South Carolina, or the events that we saw in Charlottesville, Virginia a few years ago. It was the 20 years of working on this, of the self-assessment, the organizational assessment that people in Pax Christi USA have been doing that enabled us to be able to respond to the racist and divisive rhetoric that has dominated this administration since before the president was elected. It's those anti-racism workshops that my immediate predecessors in this work, Sister Patty Chappelle and Sister Anne-Louise Nadeau of the Sisters of Notre Dame of de Nemours, who have been doing this work with religious communities, youth groups, high school students, and parishes for years. It's the hundreds of Pax Christi USA local group leaders and members who were trained in a common analysis that links prejudice and power by our Pax Christi USA anti-racism team. It was the first ever event in the U.S. Catholic Church that we helped to co-sponsor that gathered together representatives from Black, Latinx, Native American, and Asian national Catholic organizations, along with representatives from key national Catholic social justice institutions, to reflect upon the challenge of dismantling institutional racism in the church for the first time in the early 2000s. It's been the steady drumbeat of resources on our website and through our newsletters and in social media and talked about within our local groups and lived out at the grassroots level over the past 20 years that offer an anti-racist critique of our own work while also holding up and honoring the leadership of others who have offered a way forward on racial justice in our society and with whom we have often partnered. It's not a matter of just coming to the issue today, but recognizing that so much of the work is fundamentally long-term work. It's that work that Martin Luther King talked about when he talked about the arc of the universe bending towards justice, but it being a long arc. That's the kind of commitment that we have to have in terms of racial justice, racial equity, and a commitment to anti-racism in this country. So I think it's important to talk about how the field is seeded so that when we have moments like this, people in organizations like Pax Christi USA can respond from a place of deep commitment and authenticity, and not because it's the latest trend or the most important thing that is happening at the moment. So in this particular moment, because of all that work that has happened for a generation, and because of the challenge that people of color within our own church, like Father Brown, and so many within our membership at Pax Christi USA, like my mentors, like Perlette Springer and Beatrice Parwadikar and Ron Cruz, and so many others, it's important that that challenge, that work that has been done over a generation, helped us to not hesitate to speak out and make sure that our membership and the church were engaged on George Floyd's murder and the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement right from the get-go. Not because of the political ramifications, but because of what our faith calls us to, who we claim to be as followers of Jesus, what it means if we want our discipleship to have any integrity whatsoever. You'll find, if you go to the website of Pax Christi USA, that we have resources organized by prayer, study, and action, the methodology that we've been using and promoting for nearly 50 years. I would suggest that if you're interested or new to this work, that's a great place to start. We curate the best of what is out there for you to pray, study, and act in support of the Black Lives Matter movement, and we do it with an eye for what it means for Catholics, for the church. That's our intersection point. Black Lives Matter and our faith as Catholics, as disciples of Jesus. Pax Christi local groups, despite the pandemic and with an eye towards all of the things that are required in these difficult times, have been showing up across the US to support Black Lives Matter marches and actions and demonstrations. We recognize the leadership of our sisters and brothers of color who have been doing this work for a long time within our own movement and outside of it. And those of us who are white take our cue from them. We show up when we're asked to show up. We speak out when we're asked to speak out. We share resources. We promote actions. We mobilize to support advocacy actions like the Breathe Act. And we educate our own people and make sure that folks understand that race is an issue that doesn't go away. Now, Jack and Just Faith have asked me specifically to recall a few actions that people can take, especially because so many of us are operating under various levels of sheltering in place. So I think that some of these are going to be shared later over email or in another context, but I'm going to run through them on the call here with you as well. And these are just a couple things that folks within Pax Christi USA have suggested and that we've tried to put out there to our membership. As I heard in the breakout group that I was already part of, people are already reading Brian Massengale's book about racial justice in the Catholic Church. If you haven't already read it, start there. But it's important not to stop there. Yes, Brian Massengale, for those of us who are Catholic, the fact that Brian is a priest and Catholic is in the title makes it a nice entree into this issue. But again, don't stop. Read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, or Write White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, or something else. Continue the education. There's more out there, and there's more that people, especially white people, need to understand. Make this work part of a book group. Set up a listserv for it, or use a social media platform, or have a weekly Zoom call to discuss it. Turning the words in those books inward. Because again, as a white person, I want to say that white people have a gift for turning those words outward and looking at folks outside of ourselves, outside of our institutions, outside of our church, that race is something happening out there. And we don't bring that same assessment to our own selves, to our own lives. We don't bring that assessment to our own church or the organizations that we are a part of. And yet that's the most fundamental work that I think needs to happen. We need to turn those words inward. What is the work that we have to do? What is the work that our organization has to do, that our parishes have to do? Get your church on board. Prayers for racial justice should be part of the petitions every week. That's an easy check. You know, there's no reason that our church, at its very simplest, can't make that a part of every single one of the every single time when we gather together for Mass, whether it's in person or whether it's over Zoom or wherever else. Start a racial justice collaborative between churches that are predominantly white in your area and churches whose parishioners are mainly people of color. Find out what kind of anti-racist training is offered in your diocese. And when they tell you there's none offered, advocate to get it started. Ask your pastor why you don't hear about racial justice from the pulpit in his sermons. Tell him that you'd like to. Haven't been trained in anti-racism yourself? While we're all staying at home, there are plenty of good online resources, and some programs have been offering for a limited time free anti-racism training that you can do online, that you can do over Zoom calls, that you can do at your own leisure, webinars that you can be a part of, or videos that you can look at. Do an anti-racist assessment of your own life. Take one of those tests around unconscious bias and ask what it means in terms of your own personal integrity and your discipleship as a person of faith. Apply that same type of assessment to your organization. Ask fundamental questions. When we talk about discipleship questions in the church, so often they get, segmented to just a specific thing. And yet if we look at our biblical teachings, almost all the fundamental discipleship questions that Jesus asked were questions that impacted things like where we live and the kind of jobs that we have and how we spend our money. So ask those questions about whether or not we support people of color businesses. How is our anti-racism making a real change in terms of the relationships in our life, whether it's at the business level or the personal level or the church level? An important thing that I think people need to do at this moment is to support others, especially within the Catholic Church, who are speaking out about racial justice and getting silenced for it. If this happens in your diocese, let your bishop or your pastor or whoever the person is in a position of authority know that you don't approve of it. People of color in the church have dealt with this for a long time. They've been told to be patient. They've been told to tone down their rhetoric to satisfy the sensitivities of white people's ears. White people are starting to speak out too, and they're being told the same thing. The white fragility of the Catholic Church cannot be a block for honest, difficult conversations that the church needs to have. Be a supporter of those conversations and be a supporter of the people that are raising that as an issue and being told to tone it down or to quiet themselves. Race is also touching every single aspect of the work for peace and justice right now. So whether your entry point be poverty or healthcare or education, policing, criminal justice reform, or as we've seen in recent days from the Sierra Club, environmentalism, race is a component that needs to be examined, and an anti-racist lens needs to be applied to the work that we do on any of those issues. The pandemic has shown just what the disparities mean for people of color in this country when it comes to things like healthcare and education. I'd also ask you to support the Black Lives Matter movement. A rash of voices in the Catholic Church have said not to. And yet, every turn, at every place that I look, it is the prophetic words of the Black Lives Matter movement that are calling us to the most serious discipleship that we could have to Jesus in this moment in time. What is at the heart of the Black Lives Matter movement is perfectly compatible with Catholic social teaching, and it's perfectly compatible with what it is that Jesus asks of us in Scripture. So support BLM. Most important, this is the one action that I would really invite people to take, especially people who are white. And it's really simple. If this is the first time that you're making a commitment in terms of racism, stick it out. Stay with it. It's going to be hard. In an evaluation document that the Pax Christi USA anti-racism team, which is made up of both people of color and white people, did for our movement about 8 years into our anti-racism initiative, they tried to outline some of the early lessons that were learned from our efforts to build relationships of accountability with communities of color. The document that they created was aimed specifically at white folks in our membership, and one section resonates for me as a white person, as a white leader of a predominantly white organization. And this is what it says. In many communities or organizations of color, there is a long history of well-intentioned white folks who say they will stay, but in fact, we're only passing through. Part of white privilege and entitlement is having the option of taking up the anti-racism challenge when it is in their interest, or I might add, when it is trendy, and then moving on to something else when it is not. People of color do not have this luxury. White folks can walk away from the struggle. People of color cannot. So the most important action, stay. Don't walk away, even though for us who are white people, our skin color allows us to. The people of color within Pax Christi USA and within the church, as well as our friends and colleagues outside of those institutions, are watching to see how true to our word white sisters and brothers who have been trained in anti-racism are. Whether we are going to join them now, whether we are going to listen, whether we are going to show up and follow, and whether we are going to make this the tipping point for real change in our nation on issues of racial equity and racial justice. I would say that our faith demands it. Our discipleship, in the words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, is cheap if it doesn't lead us into full engagement on issues of racial justice at this moment. It would be so good to one day look back at this time and say, yes, it was then that everything changed. So that's what I got for y'all tonight. I know we've got some questions and answers, and I'm looking forward to having a little conversation around this.
Well, Johnny, thanks. That was fabulously helpful. I thought maybe I'd start, given your Catholic roots, with Pope Francis's notion of encuentro or encounter. If I read him right, I think he sees that notion of relationship as being the portal to getting woke,
Yeah.
To having some kind of transformative moment. In your experience, how important is it that white people put themselves in non-white spaces, in your experience?
In my own experience, I think that's really, really important. I think it is a way that some of the basic assumptions that we have as white people because of white privilege start to get poked and probed and uncomfortable. You know, one of the things that I have heard that have been especially challenged, and that I think is an especially good challenge for white people, is that questions and conversations around race should be uncomfortable questions for white people. They should be, it's places of discomfort and places where we're going to be uncomfortable that we need to enter into. My friends, who are people of color, have continually challenged me, and I think offer that challenge to other white people as well, that discomfort is part and parcel of it. And we need to be able to enter into spaces where we don't have control, where encounter is genuine, and where accountability is genuine as well. So yeah, I think that encounter is really important. And I think the basis of any good anti-racism work is relationship. I think that's what Pope Francis is talking about. And I think so much of what Pope Francis talks about when he talks about encounter and relationship is really good fodder for us as we embrace how it is that white people act or white people respond to this moment in terms of Black Lives Matter.
Great. Johnny, one of the things that has come up over and over again in feedback to the programs that we're offering currently on racism, in conversations that we've had previous to this one nationally, is just the question of how do I talk to my family and friends who don't see things the way I see it, who are in some ways even offended when you say the word race or racism, like it's a naughty word. So you've been doing this for 20 plus years. Give us Johnny Zokovich's 10 favorite tips for talking to our family and friends.
That's a good question, Jack. And I want to say I might have been doing it, but whether or not I've been doing it successfully is another question. I think a couple things. One is, one of the things that you asked us when we broke up into the breakout rooms was you asked where we saw hope in the current situation that we're living in. And for me, what I shared in my breakout room was that I feel like the pandemic, in some ways, because we were locked into our homes, because sports were taken away from us, because there weren't 1,000 other things to distract us, we had to pay full attention when the video of George Floyd went viral and made its way into our lives and the internet. And so many people who otherwise would never have had to sit with that, would never have maybe even seen it, saw it. They had to sit with it. It had to be part of their reality because that's what the pandemic has forced us to do. It created a moment of attentiveness or mindfulness that we don't typically have in our society. And so to me, like the thing of hope that I see is that people that have never raised questions around race and racial justice and racial equity this has been a break open moment for them. That conversations that we tried to have 5 years ago, we can have today. That conversations that we couldn't have had 6 months ago, we can have today. And there's lots of entry point for those conversations. So I don't have any exact tips. I am a big believer that to not engage in the fruitlessness of conversing with somebody who is just totally unopen to what you're talking about. Like, You just wait until the moment is there. When there's a moment, when there's an opening, I think, another thing too that I would just mention is that it's the relationship work that takes place prior to that conversation that matters so much. So if you want to have a conversation with somebody in your immediate community or family, but find it difficult in this moment, build the relationship up a little bit and maybe secure a safer space to enter into something more difficult, I would say. But yeah, I don't know. I don't have any like easy answers to that. I think they're hard questions, and I think we have to use our own, judgment about people's level of discomfort. And these are uncomfortable conversations. There isn't an easy way to do them. People are going to get offended, and we need to talk about it anyway.
Yeah. Johnny, you referred to the resistance in some parts, especially of Catholic leadership, to the Black Lives Matter movement. Can you say more about that? Is it idiosyncratic in any way, or is it in some ways just demonstrative of the wider culture?
Yeah, I don't think it's idiosyncratic. I think it's more typical. I think that the church in the United States, the Catholic Church in particular, that's my own community from which I speak, that community mirrors much of what it is that the larger society wrestles with around racial justice and racial equity. And it's something that the church, despite having all of the tools of the gospel at its disposal, the church hasn't been able to address in a way that I believe is really authentic and transformative. And a good example of that I've heard from Black clergy in particular is, the document that came out on racism a few years ago and oh my gosh, now the title's escaping me. But the idea was that the document was written in such a way as the church is speaking to communities of color, as if the church, the normative church, is the white church. And that is just totally offensive if you're a person of color, if you're part of a community of color that is as Catholic as any white Catholic is, any white clergy person is, that any bishop is. But it speaks to the deep, role that bias and systemic racism and sort of, implicit unconscious bias have within our own church, and especially within our leadership. Luckily, we have a rich group of people within the church that are providing a great counter-narrative. Brian Massengale being one of those people, Olga Segura being another person, a lot of the folks involved that I mentioned in my talk from Pax Christi USA as well. I think that there's a good counter-narrative to that. But yeah, I think still the full institution and authority of the church is not embracing, let me put it this way. Pope Francis embraces what is at the heart of Black Lives Matter more fully than the institutional church in the Catholic Church in the United States does. I think that we have a better example of how it is to, again, encounter, how it is to be in relationship from the Pope than we have from our own clergy, than we have from our own bishops. And that's not to single, and that's not to, and I do want to say there are a handful of folks that are great on this too, in the institution and in the hierarchy. I'm not dismissing those, but I'm saying overwhelmingly the weight is on the other side.
Absolutely. One of the sort of hot topics that's come up as we've seen protests happen all over the country is the language of defunding the police. And I'm wondering, for those who might be new to this conversation or feel bewildered by that language of thinking of police as simply the keepers of the peace in a community doing good work and blah, 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 if you would be willing just to speak to that concern and unpack it a little bit for those of us who are fresh to this conversation.
Yeah, I would. Jack, that's great, because that's a conversation we've been having in Pax Christi USA too. And one of the things that might resonate with some people on this call is that Pax Christi USA, as a peace and justice group, we've been talking about defunding the military for a long, long time. And there is a corollary between those two things. So first of all, I think that it's a matter of perspective of what the police look like and mean to you. And it's a matter of perspective that's tied into what your skin color is and what your community has suffered or what the encounters with police have been for the community that you identify with. And for the white community, we certainly identify our encounters for the most part in one sort of way. Police officers are polite, they help us, They are people in authority that we can look to when we need help. They protect us, those types of things. There's a whole nother narrative that is evident in the way that George Floyd was killed, in the way that Michael Brown was shot, in the way that Ahmaud Arbery and other people, Ahmaud Arbery wasn't a great example. That wasn't a police thing. Sorry, strike that. But the history of the encounters between communities of color and the police are a totally different story. And so when we talk about defunding the police, one of the things that, again, because of the corollary that Pax Christi has with defunding the military, is it's about this. It's recognizing that our ways of policing have not served our communities of color in this country. Rather, they have killed people over and over and over again in our communities of color. They've systematically been they've systematically been at the service of oppression of those communities, and that they need to be radically changed, not reformed, but radically overturned. That the perspective of policing in this country has to be radically altered so that the institution becomes something that it certainly isn't right now. So when we talk about defunding the police, we recognize that our security isn't tied into putting more boots on the ground, more guns, in the hands of police officer, more military equipment at their disposal, more surveillance, more laws. That's not that thrust, this law and order, get tough on crime thrust that we have been pursuing in this country for at least 50 years has not worked. It has done nothing to handle those issues which are at the fundamental level of the problems that we see, whether it's around crime or poverty or whatever else. So let's stop funding police solutions. Let's stop funding solutions that are aimed at security, and let's start at a certain understanding of security, and let's start funding those things that get at the root causes of why it is that communities are undermined and that people feel threatened and unsafe. How can we change and overturn that system so that communities of color that have been oppressed by the current system have their needs front and center and their needs responded to in a way that we've never wrestled with in this country?
Thanks. Here's an invitation to tell a story, if you can think of one, Johnny. Specifically, somebody would like a little glimpse into what you've described as being an anti-racism workshop. And they're just curious, like, what happens at an anti-racism workshop? Can you tell a story about someone who goes through one of the exercises and kind of what happened to them as a consequence of the exercise, if you have something like that to offer? And if you don't, I know I put you on the spot with that.
Yeah, I'll try to get to it. I might come around it in a little different way than you're asking. But what I would say is one of the things for me, from my own going through anti-racism training, that was really important and that really came out of the workshops that I've been a part of, is this understanding, is like a basic understanding of how it is that race and the question of racism permeates every institution at every level within the context of our society and our social structure. But more importantly than that there's really two concurrent narratives, parallel narratives that are always going on. One is that narrative around the history of racism, and the other is the history of resistance to racism. And so, for instance, when you ask us for where we see hope at the beginning of this call, for people that go through an anti-racism workshop, so that they don't come out of that sort of disheartened by the state, at least in my experience, they don't come out disheartened or disempowered by the immensity of the problems around racism in our country, because what they also see and where they identify and locate themselves is in that narrative of people who have stood up to and resisted racism since racism has existed. So we're able to get both of those narratives, and we're able to sort of dislocate ourselves from that history of racism and start to locate ourselves within that history of resistance to racism, and recognize who our models are, who our forebears are, what our ancestors have to teach us about standing up to racial injustice, and how we can identify and become part of that movement. So that's one of the experiences that I think people come from out of an anti-racist training or anti-racism workshop, at least the ones that I've been part of.
Yeah, great. Johnny, maybe this will be the last question. And by the way, I realize for so many of you who have submitted questions, I got overwhelmed, and delightfully so. But the question I thought we could end with is reflecting on the question of race as a man, as a white privilege. What do you feel in your gut has been the spiritual blessing of having your eyes open to a very painful reality that you recognize as being ubiquitous, difficult, and not going to be ended by the time you end your life? But in spite of that, what's been kind of the spiritual gift in it for you?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jack. I think for me, again, my background is biblical. And so, Paul's letters talk a lot about freedom. And this concept of freedom being sort of fundamental to true discipleship, to real discipleship, is really important to me. And as a white person, steeped in white privilege, who has been the beneficiary of white privilege my whole life, the invitation to address racism, the invitation to cultivate an anti-racist identity for myself and the organization that I'm a part of, what it has done is it's an invitation to a wholeness that was lacking before. That my own humanity is scarred by the racism that I have unconsciously or consciously participated in throughout history. It is an impediment to deep discipleship to Jesus for me. If I live a life of unconscious, unexamined racism and privilege, then that's an impediment for me to follow Jesus at the deepest level that I really would like to. So the challenge is that in anti-racism is that it frees us. It gives us the freedom to break out of the chains that keep us from being able to pursue our vocation as disciples to Jesus at its most authentic, relevant, deep, and meaningful level.
Fabulous, Johnny. Thank you. Well, this is a strange forum for a speaker. You're talking and no one can clap. But Johnny, I'd like to invite everybody who's watching right now to put your hands in front of your screen and give Johnny a thank you for the fabulous presentation. So thank you so much. Let me just remind folks of a couple of things. Number one, if on Monday, Leela will be sending out a follow-up email with some of the action steps that Johnny mentioned. If you have any follow-up questions that we weren't able to get to, you can send them to us, and if we can't answer them, we'll send them to Johnny. And again, one of the learning options, one of the educational options that's available to all of you, of course, are one of the 3 8-session modules that Just Faith Ministries currently offers, which have been widely acclaimed and are making a tremendous impact. So just a couple of invitations. So let me close with a prayer. And this comes from Catholic Charities USA. God of justice, in your wisdom you create all people in your image without exception. Through your goodness, open our eyes to see the dignity, the beauty, and worth of every human being. Open our minds to understand that all your children are sisters and brothers in the same human family. Open our hearts to repent of racist attitudes or behaviors, speech, which demean others. Open our ears to hear the cries of those wounded by racial discrimination and their passionate appeals for change. Strengthen our resolve to make amends for past injustices and to right the wrongs of history. And fill us with courage that we might seek to heal wounds, to build bridges, to forgive and be forgiven, and establish peace and equality for all in our communities. And so, in Jesus' name, we pray, amen.